The tactical logic of the Jakarta underworld is undergoing a total system audit. Imagine a biological asset, stripped of empathy, recalibrated for total erasure. A 17-year-old girl, coded for destruction, finds her internal programming glitching when a young life hangs in the balance. This is high-energy displacement. This is a ballistic trajectory into the heart of an Indonesian crime syndicate. From the razor-sharp kinetic vectors of a Japanese dojo to the pressurized architecture of a hidden club, the displacement of power is absolute. We are witnessing the birth of a new apex predator in a world where shadows do more than just follow. They strike. They bleed. They redefine the metric of vengeance. Brace for a forensic deconstruction of the cinematic infrastructure. We are entering the terminal phase of the shadow program. This isn't just an action movie. It's a diagnostic of biological assets operating at peak velocity. The hardware is lethal. The software is compromised. The result is total systemic failure for anyone standing in the way. Prepare for a high-retention, kinetic experience that resets the calibration for the entire genre. The target is locked. The displacement is imminent. This is the Shadow Strays 2024. The core infrastructure of the Shadow Strays serves as a high-velocity entry into the 2024 cinematic pipeline. Released globally via the Netflix distribution node on October 17, 2024, the film represents a critical calibration of the Indonesian action thriller genre. The blueprint was drafted and executed by the director and writer, Timo Tjahjanto, a figure whose previous architectural works, such as The Big Four, established a baseline for high-impact kinetic displacement. In the current system state, the narrative follows code name 13, a 17-year-old biological asset functioning within an international killing organization known as the Shadows. The initial diagnostic of the plot begins in Japan, where a botched mission leads to a psychological suspension, shifting the asset's coordinates back to Jakarta. This serves as the primary logic gate for the story. As a work of crime thriller logic, the film's infrastructure is built on the friction between duty and biological impulse. The Shadows operate as a global network, a hardware system designed for untraceable assassination. However, the asset, codenamed 13, later identified as Nomi, encounters a terminal error in her programming after a bystander is neutralized during a mission. This event triggers a mandatory audit of her psychological stability, leading to a period of enforced latency in a Jakarta apartment complex. It is here that the narrative pipeline introduces the secondary asset, an 11-year-old boy named Monji. The interaction between Nomi and Monji creates a new kinetic vector, shifting the mission parameters from state-sanctioned erasure to unauthorized protection. The film's global metrics are significant, premiering at the Toronto International Film Festival during the Midnight Madness section on September 10, 2024. The project received an immediate high-retention response from critics. The forensic data shows an 89% rating on the Rotten Tomatoes aggregate node, a metric that confirms the film's status as a high-performance asset in the non-English film category. Furthermore, the infrastructure of the film was recognized at the 2025 Indonesian Film Festival, where it secured 12 separate nominations. This level of recognition serves as a performance metric for the production companies involved, including Frontier Pictures, which managed the logistical load of the high-octane stunt engineering required for the project. The genre logic is strictly calibrated for maximum ballistic impact. While categorized broadly as an action crime thriller, the film utilizes elements of martial arts hardware, specifically silat and kenjutsu, to create a unique combat architecture. This is not a standard rescue narrative. It is a forensic deconstruction of a crime syndicate's hierarchy. The pipeline moves from the micro-level conflict of neighborhood drug traffickers to the macro-level corruption of political candidates and crime lords. Every story beat acts as a diagnostic of power displacement. As Nomi traverses this tactical geometry, the audience is presented with a data-heavy exploration of what happens when a weapon of the state develops a soul. The resulting friction is both violent and structurally sound. To understand the system state of the shadow strays, one must audit the architectural vision of Timothy Giorgianto and his cinematographer, Batara Gompa. The production pipeline utilized high-end hardware, specifically the Arri Alexa Mini LF camera system, to capture the high-velocity kinetic vectors of the combat sequences. This choice in hardware allowed for a wider sensor area, providing a unique depth of field that isolates the biological assets against the volumetric haze of the Jakarta slums. The lens axis was further enhanced through the use of anamorphic glass, which creates a specific optical distortion at the edges of the frame. This calibration was intentional, designed to mirror the asset's fragmented internal programming and the pressurized environment of the criminal underworld. The lighting logic of the film is governed by the Kelvin scale, moving from the cold, clinical blues of the Japanese dojo to the warm, chromatic saturation of the Moonrose Club. The cinematographer utilized a color palette that emphasizes high-contrast displacement. Shadows are not merely an absence of light in this infrastructure. They are a tactical layer of the geometry. Every frame is calibrated to emphasize the specular glint of a katana or the muzzle flash of a suppressed firearm. This visual language is supported by a lighting rig that allows for fluid motion, tracking Nomi as she moves through the tactical geometry of each set. The result is a cinematic pipeline that feels both grounded in physical reality and elevated by stylistic excess. Stunt engineering served as the primary load-bearing pillar for the production. Giorgianto and his team utilized a rigorous training diagnostic for the lead actors, specifically Aurora Ribero. The logistics of the action required a 4-month calibration period, where the biological assets were stress-tested to ensure they could handle the inertia of the choreography. The lens captured these movements in long, continuous takes, reducing the reliance on rapid-fire editing rhythms, and instead allowing the kinetic vectors to play out in real time. This approach increases the cognitive load on the viewer, forcing an audit of every strike and displacement. The displacement of blood and the biological fallout of the kills are captured with a forensic level of detail, emphasizing the friction between human flesh and cold steel. The audio pipeline was equally calibrated for peak impact. The soundscape utilizes a mix of industrial synthesis and high-frequency ballistic transients. Every impact is rendered with a heavy thermal load, giving the violence a mechanical weight. The use of volumetric haze in the visuals is matched by a dense atmospheric audio layer, creating a sense of total immersion. This is the hardware of modern Indonesian action cinema, a system that refuses to compromise on intensity or technical precision. From the lens axis to the audio mix, the architecture of the shadow strays is a diagnostic of a director operating at the height of his powers, pushing the cinematic pipeline to its terminal limits. Codename 13, later identified as Nomi, represents the primary biological asset in the shadow infrastructure. Played by Aurora Ribero, the asset is a 17-year-old female recalibrated from a young age for state-sanctioned erasure. Her internal programming is built on a logic of absolute obedience and tactical efficiency. However, the forensic audit of her character begins with a system failure. During the Japan mission, Nomi's kinetic vector is interrupted by a biological impulse, the recognition of a bystander. This creates a cognitive load that she cannot resolve, leading to a botched execution. This terminal error in her software is the catalyst for her suspension and subsequent relocation to the Jakarta sector. Nomi's physical hardware is a metric of high-performance stunt engineering. Unlike previous biological assets in the genre who rely on raw thermal force, Nomi utilizes velocity and displacement. Her combat style is a mix of silat and improvisational geometry. She treats every environment as a tactical map, using the gravitational constraints of her surroundings to neutralize larger targets. The forensic deconstruction of her fight in the Moonrose Club reveals an asset operating at peak synaptic response. She does not merely strike, She calculates the most efficient ballistic trajectory for every move. Her weapon of choice, the katana, acts as an extension of her lens axis, slicing through the syndicate infrastructure with surgical precision. The evolution of the asset from codename 13 to Nomi is a diagnostic of moral recalibration. As she interacts with the Monji asset, her internal programming begins to override the shadow protocols. This is not a sentimental shift, but a logical displacement. She recognizes the child as a casualty of the same syndicate infrastructure that she was designed to protect in her previous life. Her mission parameters shift from erasure to preservation. This creates a high-pressure friction with her mentor, Umbra, who represents the stable system state that Nomi is now rejecting. The biological fallout of this choice is severe, as Nomi becomes a target for the very organization that built her. Aurora Ribero's performance is a metric of total commitment to the hardware. The physical toll of the role is evident in every frame, as her biological asset is pushed to its displacement limit. Her facial expressions are often locked in a state of clinical focus, only cracking when the cognitive load of her trauma becomes too great to ignore. This is a forensic look at the cost of being a weapon. Nomi is not a hero in the traditional sense. She is a calibrated instrument of death trying to find a reason to stop. Her journey is a terminal pipeline toward a final system reset, where she must choose between the name given to her by the shadows and the name she chooses for herself. The shadow organization is maintained through a strict hierarchy of control assets, primarily the mentor and the handler. Umbra, played by Hana Malasan, serves as the primary mentor for codename 13. Her role in the infrastructure is to ensure the stability of the assets and to act as a fail-safe against psychological terminal errors. Umbra is a veteran biological asset, a character whose own internal programming has been hardened through years of successful erasures. However, the forensic audit of the film reveals that even Umbra is subject to biological impulse. During her mission in Cambodia, she hesitates to execute a pregnant asset, Volver, indicating a systemic vulnerability in the shadow pipeline. The relationship between Umbra and Nomi is one of calibration and friction. Umbra views Nomi as her own creation, a biological extension of her tactical philosophy. When Nomi's programming begins to fail, Umbra attempts to reset the asset through discipline and retraining. This is a diagnostic of a mentor trying to preserve a failing system. The kinetic vectors between them are not just physical but ideological. As the narrative progresses, the mentor asset is forced to confront her own internal contradictions. The final system state of their relationship is one of mutual displacement, as they are eventually ordered to neutralize one another. This is the ultimate terminal protocol of the shadow organization. The handler, played by Chu Kin-hwa, represents the command center of the shadow infrastructure. He is the logic gate through which all missions are filtered. His perspective is purely metric-driven. Assets are hardware to be used and discarded when they no longer function within the established calibration. The handler does not possess a kinetic vector of his own. Instead, he manipulates the displacements of others from a distance. He is the architect of the terminal orders, the one who initiates the purge protocols when an asset becomes a liability. His presence in the film serves as a forensic reminder of the cold, mechanical nature of the organization that built Nomi. Together, Umbra and the handler form the structural nodes that Nomi must break to achieve autonomy. The mentor offers a false sense of biological connection, while the handler offers a clinical sense of purpose. Neither is compatible with Nomi's new calibration. The friction between these three assets creates the thermal load that drives the film toward its violent conclusion. When the handler eventually enters the tactical geometry of the final battle, it signifies a total system failure. The organization can no longer hide behind its assets. It must face the biological fallout of its own creation. The result is a total erasure of the old command structure. To audit the enemies of codename 13, we must analyze the criminal syndicate's infrastructure in Jakarta. This system is a multi-layered hierarchy involving traffickers, corrupt law enforcement, and political assets. At the street level, the diagnostic begins with Haga and his twin sister, Soraya. They operate as the logistical nodes for human trafficking and drug displacement. Haga is a volatile asset, prone to high-energy outbursts that create friction within the syndicate's broader logic. Soraya, conversely, represents a more calculated thermal load, managing the Moonrose Club as a tactical base for their operations. Their neutralization by Nomi is the first major disruption to the syndicate's system state. The corruption extends into the judicial and political sectors, represented by Detective Prasidio and the candidate Ariel. Prasidio acts as the syndicate's security hardware, using his position within the police pipeline to protect their illegal displacements. He is a metric of systemic failure, a man whose duty has been completely overwritten by greed. Ariel represents the terminal point of the syndicate's ambition, a biological asset seeking to move from the underworld into the legitimate power architecture of the state. His involvement in the trafficking of children, including the Monji asset, is the primary friction point that leads Nomi to his doorstep. The overhead command for this syndicate is Somitro, Ariel's crime boss father. He represents the legacy hardware of the Jakarta underworld. His mansion is a tactical geometry of luxury and violence, a pressurized environment where he audits the performance of his subordinates. Somitro is a calculating asset who understands the value of a shadow. When Nomi is captured, he does not initiate immediate erasure, but instead attempts to recalibrate her as a protective asset for a high-stakes drug deal with Abai Kabul. This choice leads to a massive displacement of fire and blood, as the drug deal triggers a terminal shootout that wipes out the syndicate's top-level infrastructure. The syndicate serves as a forensic mirror to the Shadow organization. Both are hierarchies built on erasure and control, but while the Shadows operate with clinical precision, the syndicate is a messy, high-friction system driven by human ego and appetite. The biological fallout of their conflict with Nomi is absolute. By the end of the narrative pipeline, the syndicate's tactical geometry has been completely deconstructed. Every node, from Haga to Ariel to Somitro, has been neutralized. This total systemic failure is the result of Nomi's kinetic intervention. She is the external variable that the syndicate's logic could not account for, a high-velocity force that reset the calibration of the entire Jakarta sector. The forensic deconstruction of the Japan mission reveals a significant calibration error in the Shadow infrastructure. Moving from the initial deployment to the dojo environment, the biological asset known as Code 13 initiates a high-velocity kinetic vector. The architecture of this sequence is defined by a 2.39 to 1 anamorphic lens axis, which creates a specific optical distortion that isolates the targets within the tactical geometry of the room. As 13 engages the Yakuza leadership, her velocity is governed by the inertia of her physical hardware. Every strike represents a calculated displacement of force designed to neutralize the opposing hardware. However, the system state of the mission is compromised when an external variable, a young bystander, enters the ballistic trajectory of the conflict. The diagnostic of the botched mission centers on a terminal error in the asset's internal programming. While her training dictated absolute erasure of all biological obstacles, 13 experiences a synaptic response that leads to a momentary pause in her kinetic vector. This latency allowed for the unintentional neutralization of a non-target asset, creating a massive biological fallout within the organization's logic. The forensic audit of the dojo scene shows that the focal length was tightly calibrated on 13's eyes to capture the exact moment of cognitive load. The resulting friction between her primary directive and her emerging empathy created a thermal load that the Shadow program could not ignore. This calibration error triggered an immediate audit by the handler. The organization's blueprint for biological assets does not allow for such variables. Consequently, the asset was put into a state of psychological suspension, a period of forced latency designed to recalibrate her synaptic pathways. The propulsion force of the narrative now shifts from the dojo to the cold, clinical spaces of the shadow headquarters. Here, the Kelvin scale of the lighting shifts toward the lower end, emphasizing the chromatic saturation of the blue spectrum. This visual choice reinforces the internal programming reset that 13 is forced to undergo. The diagnostic is clear. The asset is drifting away from its intended blueprint. The inertia of the Japan incident follows 13 back to Jakarta. The ballistic trajectory of her career has been deflected, forcing her into a system state of isolation. This period of latency is not just a punishment but a forensic test of her psychological hardware. As she reflects on the biological fallout of her actions in Japan, her cognitive load increases. The shadow organization views this as a terminal error, but for the asset, it is the beginning of a new internal calibration. The tactical geometry of her future missions will no longer be dictated solely by the handler's pipeline, but by the friction of her own conscience. The transition to the Jakarta sector introduces a new tactical geometry defined by volumetric haze and low-light chromatic saturation. 13, now operating under the name Nomi, resides in a high-density apartment complex that serves as her current architectural constraint. The forensic audit of this environment reveals a system state of urban decay, where the lighting is calibrated according to the orange and teal spectrum of the Kelvin scale. The focal length used in these sequences emphasizes the depth of field between Nomi and the local biological assets, specifically the young boy, Monji. This relationship acts as a behavioral stimulus, triggering a reset of Nomi's internal programming. As Nomi audits her surroundings, she encounters Muresti, an escort asset linked to the local trafficker Haga. The infrastructure of the neighborhood is governed by a criminal logic that thrives on the displacement of resources and people. When Muresti is neutralized by a drug-related thermal load, the biological fallout affects the Monji asset most directly. Nomi's synaptic response to Monji's distress signifies a shift in her primary kinetic vector. She is no longer just a weapon in the shadow pipeline. She is becoming an independent actor within the tactical geometry of the slums. The volumetric haze of the city acts as a visual metaphor for the moral ambiguity of her current mission. The displacement of Monji by the Haga Syndicate creates a high-pressure friction that overrides Nomi's suspension protocols. Her internal programming, once dedicated to state-sanctioned erasure, is now calibrated toward the retrieval of the missing asset. The diagnostic of her apartment and the surrounding street-level infrastructure shows a high cognitive load, as she utilizes her forensic training to trace Monji's ballistic trajectory. The use of anamorphic lenses in these scenes heightens the optical distortion of the city, reflecting the chaotic system state of the Jakarta underworld. Every interaction she has with the local hardware, informants and low-level traffickers, is a diagnostic of her increasing velocity. The behavioral stimulus of the Monji-Nomi bond is the core load-bearing pillar of this act. The forensic deconstruction of their early interactions reveals a tactical shift in Nomi's hardware. She is learning to operate outside the gravitational constraints of the shadow organization. The internal programming that once made her an efficient killer is now being used to audit a different kind of crime. As she prepares to enter the Moonrose Club, her kinetic vector is no longer driven by a mission brief, but by a personal diagnostic of justice. The tactical haze of the slums is beginning to clear, revealing a direct pipeline to the heart of the syndicate. Entering the Moonrose Club signifies a total displacement of the status quo and a massive increase in the thermal load of the narrative. The tactical geometry of the club is a pressurized environment calibrated for high-energy combat. As Nomi enters the infrastructure, the lighting shifts to a high chromatic saturation of red and purple, emphasizing the danger of the kinetic vectors about to be released. The forensic audit of this sequence reveals a masterclass in stunt engineering, where the velocity of the assets is matched by a fluid lens axis that tracks every strike. The propulsive force of Nomi's entry is absolute, as she neutralizes the syndicate's hardware with surgical precision. The kinetic friction between Nomi and Haga's security detail is a diagnostic of high-performance martial arts logic. Utilizing a focal length that keeps the depth of field wide, the production allows the audience to see the full displacement of bodies across the room. Nomi's use of a katana within the architectural constraints of the club creates a unique ballistic trajectory for every kill. The forensic deconstruction of the choreography shows a reliance on inertia and leverage, as Nomi uses the syndicate's own mass against them. Every impact is rendered with a high thermal load, emphasizing the biological fallout of her intervention. Haga, as the primary target asset, is caught in a state of terminal error as his infrastructure collapses around him. As the raid progresses, the tactical geometry shifts from the open floor to the more confined spaces of the club's back rooms. This creates a new set of gravitational constraints that Nomi must navigate. The optical distortion of the anamorphic lenses increases in these tight spaces, reflecting the rising cognitive load on both the asset and her enemies. When she finally reaches Haga, the kinetic friction reaches its peak. The displacement of the trafficker asset is not just physical but symbolic, as Nomi erases a key node in the syndicate's pipeline. The forensic data shows that the specular glint on the blade was used to draw the lens axis toward the final point of impact. The aftermath of the Moonrose raid reveals the extent of the biological fallout. Nomi has successfully displaced a major criminal infrastructure, but in doing so, she has attracted the diagnostic attention of the syndicate's higher-level hardware. The kinetic vector she initiated in the club is now a direct pipeline to the political and judicial corruption at the top. The forensic audit of the scene shows a high level of physical displacement, as the club is left in a system state of total destruction. Nomi's internal programming has now been fully recalibrated for this unauthorized mission. The propulsive force of her vengeance is the new primary variable in the Jakarta sector. Parallel to Nomi's actions in Jakarta, the shadow infrastructure continues its global erasures, specifically the Cambodian mission led by Umbra. The forensic audit of this sequence reveals a different system state, one characterized by long-range ballistic trajectories and tactical isolation. The Kelvin scale of the Cambodian exterior is high, moving toward a bleached-out chromatic saturation that emphasizes the heat and the thermal load of the jungle environment. Umbra's mission is to neutralize a fellow biological asset, Volver, who has been flagged as a terminal error within the organization's blueprint. The diagnostic of the Volver asset reveals a major biological variable. She is pregnant. This introduces a cognitive load for Umbra that the Shadow pipeline did not anticipate. The internal programming of the Mentor asset is built on absolute erasure, yet the sight of a new life creates a friction that Umbra cannot immediately resolve. The forensic deconstruction of her hesitation shows a synaptic response similar to the one Nomi experienced in Japan. The gravitational constraints of her duty are being pulled by a human impulse. However, the system state of the mission is quickly reset when the secondary assassin asset, Troika, arrives to complete the erasure. The biological fallout of the Cambodian mission is a critical metric for the Shadow organization's cruelty. Volver is neutralized, and Umbra is left to audit her own loyalty to the blueprint. The focal length used during the execution of Volver is tight and clinical, capturing the displacement of the target without empathy. This sequence serves as a forensic contrast to Nomi's journey. While Nomi is choosing to save a life, the organization is doubling down on its terminal protocols. The internal programming of the Shadows is shown to be a closed-loop system that erases any variable that threatens its calibration. Umbra's return from Cambodia marks a shift in her tactical perspective. The synaptic response she experienced has left a residual cognitive load. She begins to audit the handler's decisions with a forensic level of scrutiny. The relationship between the Mentor and the Shadow pipeline is moving toward a state of high friction. As she prepares to hunt Nomi, the biological fallout of the Cambodia incident follows her. The tactical geometry of the upcoming conflict between the two assets will be defined by this shared terminal error. The organization's hardware is becoming unstable, as its most efficient weapons begin to question their internal programming. The narrative pipeline now moves to the Syndicate's overhead command at the aerial mansion. The tactical geometry of this location is defined by a high-security infrastructure and a system state of absolute corruption. Nomi's infiltration represents a high-velocity kinetic vector into the heart of the Syndicate's power. The architectural layout of the mansion provides multiple ballistic trajectories for the upcoming conflict. As Nomi breaches the perimeter, the lens axis tracks her displacement across the grounds, utilizing a focal length that highlights the volumetric haze of the rainy Jakarta night. The forensic audit of her hardware shows an asset pushing the limits of her physical velocity. Inside the mansion, Nomi encounters the Syndicate's primary hardware assets, Detective Prasidio and Ariel. The diagnostic of this environment reveals a high level of psychological friction. Prasidio, as a corrupt law enforcement asset, uses his position to create a tactical advantage, but his kinetic response is no match for Nomi's calibrated speed. The forensic deconstruction of their encounter shows a high thermal load, as Nomi utilizes the mansion's geometry to corner the detective. The displacement of Prasidio is a key story beat, representing the neutralization of the Syndicate's judicial shield. However, the mission parameters shift when Nomi is eventually captured through a tactical error of her own. The system state of Nomi's capture at the mansion is a diagnostic of the Syndicate's countermeasures. Mitro, the crime boss asset, audits Nomi's potential as a weapon rather than immediately initiating her erasure. This choice introduces a new variable into the pipeline. He intends to use her as protective hardware during an upcoming drug deal, a move that increases the cognitive load on all assets involved. The focal length used during Nomi's interrogation is shallow, isolating her within the architectural cage of the mansion. The chromatic saturation of the room is low, reflecting the cold logic of Mitro's decision. The internal programming of the asset is now being tested by an external force other than the shadows. The mansion infiltration concludes with a terminal setup for the film's climax. The kinetic friction has been building toward a massive displacement of force. Nomi is now a prisoner within the very infrastructure she intended to destroy, but her synaptic response remains sharp. She is auditing the Syndicate's hardware even as she is held captive. The forensic data suggests that the upcoming drug deal will be the site of a total system failure. The ballistic trajectories of the shadows, the Syndicate, and Nomi are all converging on a single point. The biological fallout will be catastrophic. The diagnostic is final. The tactical geometry of Jakarta is about to be rewritten in blood. The forensic deconstruction moves now to the terminal exchange between the Syndicate infrastructure and the Cabal hardware. The tactical geometry of this encounter is defined by a high-pressure drug exchange that serves as the primary site for a total system failure. As the biological assets from the aerial Syndicate and the Cabal forces converge, the thermal load of the environment increases exponentially. The blueprint for this sequence relies on high-velocity kinetic vectors, where every discharge is a diagnostic of ballistic efficacy. The lens axis utilizes a focal length that captures the wide displacement of the assets across the industrial set. Within this infrastructure, Code 13, initially recalibrated as a protective asset, becomes the primary variable that triggers a chain reaction of neutralizing force. Moving from the initial dialogue to the active kinetic phase, the forensic data tracks the ignition of high-capacity hardware. Every muzzle flash creates a specular glint that reflects off the volumetric haze of the sector. The internal programming of the Syndicate guards is overwritten by panic as the ballistic trajectories intersect from multiple angles. This is not a coordinated mission. It is a chaotic displacement of power. The physics of the encounter show a high degree of inertia as vehicles are utilized as temporary architectural cover. The chromatic saturation shifts toward a high-contrast spectrum, where the red transients of blood contrast against the cold Kelvin scale of the industrial lighting. The diagnostic of the shootout highlights the absolute biological fallout of the encounter. As the kinetic friction between the two groups reaches its peak, the Cabal assets are neutralized in rapid succession. The propulsive force of the weaponry involved creates a system state of total destruction. The forensic audit reveals that the aerial asset attempts to maintain control of the tactical geometry, but the intervention of 13 introduces a kinetic vector that he cannot calculate. The displacement of the crime boss, Mitro, occurs during this peak thermal load, signifying the terminal failure of the syndicate's leadership hardware. The infrastructure of the underworld is effectively erased in this single ballistic event. Analyzing the optical distortion in these sequences, the anamorphic pipeline emphasizes the isolation of 13 as she navigates the crossfire. Her velocity remains constant, while the surrounding assets experience total systemic collapse. The depth of field is used to audit the carnage in the background, while keeping the primary asset in sharp focus. This calibration forces the viewer to process the high cognitive load of the violence. Every strike and discharge is a metric of the asset's lethality. By the time the final ballistic trajectory is completed, the site has been converted from a site of commerce into a forensic morgue. The thermal load has reached its maximum, leaving only the biological fallout of a dead empire. The forensic diagnostic of the narrative must address the biological fallout involving the Monji asset. Despite the high-velocity rescue attempt, the young asset's physical hardware has reached a state of terminal error. The medical infrastructure within the aerial mansion is audited as insufficient to reverse the damage caused by the earlier thermal load of the kidnapping. As Nomi attempts to stabilize the boy, the focal length of the anamorphic lens narrows, isolating their interaction from the surrounding tactical geometry. This creates a high cognitive load for the viewer, as the biological reality of the child's decline is documented with clinical precision. The synaptic response of Code 13 begins to deviate from her internal programming as she recognizes the finality of the system failure. The death of the Monji asset acts as a behavioral stimulus that resets Nomi's kinetic vector. The forensic deconstruction of her reaction reveals a shift from tactical mission logic to a state of total systemic vengeance. This is a terminal error in the Shadow Organization's blueprint. They built a weapon that can feel the weight of a life lost. The biological fallout is not just the death of the child, but the destruction of the asset's remaining loyalty to her handlers. The Kelvin scale in these scenes drops, creating a cold, chromatic saturation that mirrors the asset's internal calibration. There is no volumetric haze here. The loss is clear, sharp, and absolute. Moving from the grief state to the final active phase, Nomi executes a diagnostic of her remaining hardware. The death of Monji has removed all gravitational constraints on her violence. The forensic audit of her final encounter with Ariel shows a displacement of power that is purely retaliatory. The kinetic vector she applies to the candidate asset is designed for maximum biological impact. The lens axis tracks the final ballistic trajectory of her vengeance, with a forensic focus on the specular glint of the blade. The infrastructure of the syndicate is now officially erased, but the cost to the asset's internal programming is a total reset. She is no longer Code 13. She has achieved a new system state through loss. The biological fallout of the Monji casualty serves as the emotional load-bearing pillar for the film's finale. It is the metric by which Nomi's transformation is measured. The diagnostic shows that her synaptic pathways have been permanently altered by the behavioral stimulus of the child's presence and subsequent erasure. In the tactical geometry of the Jakarta underworld, Monji was a variable that the logic of crime could not account for. His death is the final terminal error that leads to the total forensic deconstruction of the city's criminal pipeline. The asset stands alone, a ghost within the machine, waiting for the inevitable shadow audit. The final audit of the film's infrastructure requires a diagnostic of the duel between Umbra and Nomi. This sequence is the ultimate test of the Shadow Organization's internal programming. The tactical geometry of the final sector is a cold, expansive space that minimizes distractions and focuses entirely on the kinetic friction between the two assets. The lens axis utilized in this sequence is strictly anamorphic, creating an optical distortion that elongates the distance between the mentor and the apprentice. As the fight initiates, the kinetic vectors are calibrated for maximum precision. Every strike is a diagnostic of their shared training, a displacement of force that is both familiar and lethal. The forensic deconstruction of the fight reveals a system state of high inertia. Umbra operates with the clinical logic of the shadow blueprint, her movements dictated by years of successful erasures. Nomi, however, utilizes a velocity that is fueled by her psychological reset. The friction between their blades creates a specular glint that punctuate the high chromatic saturation of the neon lighting. The Kelvin scale is pushed to its limits here, with deep blues and purples dominating the spectrum. This visual calibration emphasizes the terminal nature of the conflict. It is a duel between the old hardware and the new, a diagnostic of which internal programming is truly superior. As the kinetic friction reaches its peak, the behavioral stimulus of their shared history begins to interfere with the shadow logic. Umbra's internal programming experiences an override when she places a blade to Nomi's throat. The forensic data shows a synaptic response that prevents her from executing the final erasure. This is the terminal protocol of the mentor asset. She cannot destroy what she has built. This systemic failure is audited by the handler, who intervenes to enforce the organization's blueprint. The resulting biological fallout is the neutralization of Umbra, an act that serves as the final catalyst for Nomi's total autonomy. The displacement of the mentor by the handler is the ultimate betrayal of the shadow infrastructure. The duel concludes with the erasure of the handler asset. Nomi's kinetic vector is absolute as she neutralizes the command node of her former organization. The forensic audit of this kill shows a ballistic trajectory that is cold, efficient, and devoid of shadow logic. The internal programming override is complete. The asset has purged the organization from her system state. As Umbra reveals her true name, Nomi, before the terminal shutdown of her hardware, the transformation is finished. The biological fallout of the shadow program is a single, autonomous asset standing among the ruins of her past. The tactical geometry is empty. The mission is over. The epilogue of the narrative pipeline introduces a final variable into the diagnostic, Master Buren. Played by Yayan Ruhian, this asset represents the legacy hardware of the shadow program, a predecessor to Umbra. His entry into the tactical geometry is marked by a high-velocity neutralization of the remaining shadows who were pursuing Nomi. The forensic audit of Buren's kinetic vectors shows a different calibration of force, one that relies on extreme inertia and the displacement of multiple targets simultaneously. He is a metric of what the shadow assets could become if they operated outside the handler's pipeline. Buren's interaction with Nomi acts as a final behavioral stimulus. He recognizes her system state as one of potential apprenticeship. His invitation to join him is a logic gate that offers Nomi a new blueprint for her existence. The forensic deconstruction of this scene shows a shift in the Kelvin scale toward a more natural, grounded spectrum. The volumetric haze of the city is replaced by the clear, sharp optics of the forest sector. This visual reset symbolizes the asset's move from the artificial constraints of the organization to a more primal, individualistic calibration. The internal programming of Nomi is now open for a new set of instructions, defined by her own name rather than a numeric code. The Master Buren protocol is the film's final system state. It suggests that while the old infrastructure has been erased, the kinetic potential of the biological assets remains. Nomi's acceptance of the apprenticeship is the final story beat, a diagnostic of her resilience and her refusal to be neutralized. The legacy of the shadows will continue, but it will be recalibrated through the lens of those who broke the system. The forensic audit of the film's conclusion points to a future where the displacement of power is no longer governed by a global command, but by the kinetic will of the individual. The system has been reset. The audit is complete. The forensic summary of The Shadow Strays must conclude with an audit of its global performance metrics. In the 2024 non-English film category, the project achieved a high retention status on the Netflix platform within 6 days of its release. The diagnostic data confirms its presence in the top 10 lists of 85 different countries. This is a significant metric for the Indonesian cinematic pipeline, demonstrating the global appetite for high-octane displacement and tactical action. The infrastructure of the film was built for international consumption, and the metrics confirm its successful calibration. Critical reception serves as a secondary diagnostic of the film's architecture. With an 89% rating on the Rotten Tomatoes node, the film has been audited as a superior asset in the action thriller genre. Critics have specifically highlighted the stunt engineering and the high chromatic saturation of the optics as load-bearing pillars of its success. The biological performance of Aurora, Ribero, and Hana, Malasan provided the necessary psychological friction to balance the film's intense kinetic vectors. As the project enters the 2025 awards pipeline with 12 Indonesian Film Festival nominations, its status as a high-performance cinematic hardware is solidified. The final audit is clear. The Shadow Strays is a landmark in tactical storytelling, a diagnostic of violence that has set a new calibration for the entire industry.